Somewhere in the hold of a troop transport cutting through the Atlantic in the spring of 1919, a rifle disappeared. Not on a battlefield, not under German fire, not in the mud of the Argonne Forest where 28 men had already died. It vanished on the way home, stolen, most likely, by someone who understood its value in a way its owner never would. The man who carried that rifle across France never asked for it back. He never told investigators its serial number. He never filed a report. He never placed an ad in a newspaper or spoke publicly about its loss. And for the rest of his life, 45 more years, Alvin York simply went home to Tennessee and left the most famous rifle in America somewhere in the dark. The question that haunts historians, collectors, and anyone who has ever held a Springfield 1903 in their hands is not whether the rifle can be found. It is why a man who had just become the most celebrated soldier in the country didn't seem to care. The answer tells you everything about who Alvin York was and almost nothing about the gun. If you've never heard this story before, you're going to want to stay until the end. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell. We cover history the way it deserves to be covered. To understand why York let that rifle go, you have to go back to the beginning. Not to France. Not to the Argonne. You have to go back to a 2-room log cabin in the hills of Tennessee, where a boy grew up who wrote on his draft card, in pencil, in 1917, "Don't want to fight." Alvin Cullum York was born on December 13, 1887, in Pall Mall, Tennessee, a settlement so remote that most Americans had never heard of it and couldn't have found it on a map. He was the third of 11 children. His father was a part-time blacksmith and subsistence farmer. The family eked out a living on what the land gave them and what the forest offered. York received roughly 9 months of formal education in his entire life. What the Tennessee mountains gave him instead was a marksman's eye. From boyhood, he hunted turkey and deer in those hills with the kind of instinctive accuracy that comes only from years of needing to make every shot count. Ammunition cost money. A missed shot meant an empty table. Alvin York didn't miss. But the mountains also gave him something else, a faith that would define him far more than any rifle ever could. In January 1915, after years of hard drinking and brawling, York walked into the Church of Christ in Christian Union and didn't come back out the same man. The conversion was, by every account, complete and sincere. He stopped drinking, he stopped fighting, he became, in the language of his community and his time, a man of God, and the God he found was a God who did not permit killing. The church's doctrine was explicit on the subject. No Christian under its covenant had any business carrying a weapon against another human being. When America entered the war in April 1917 and York received his draft notice from his friend and pastor Rosier Pyle, the inner conflict was immediate and overwhelming. He wrote about it later in his diary with the raw honesty of a man who was not accustomed to hiding anything. "I didn't know what to do. I'm telling you, there was a war going on inside me, and I didn't know which side to lean to. I was a heap bothered. It is a most awful thing when the wishes of your God and your country get mixed up and go against each other." He filed for conscientious objector status. The draft board denied him twice, then 3 times, because the Church of Christ in Christian Union was not recognized as a legitimate Christian denomination. The law did not see his faith as real enough to excuse him from service. York reported for duty at Camp Gordon, Georgia, carrying a Bible in one hand and a conscience that would not rest. At Camp Gordon, something unusual happened. York's commanding officer, Captain Edward Danforth, and his battalion commander, Major G. Edward Buxton, were both committed Christians who recognized the depth of York's moral crisis. Instead of dismissing him or threatening him, they sat down with him and opened their Bibles. The conversations went late into the night, sometimes for hours. York would quote a verse that opposed killing. Buxton would find a verse that justified it. Back and forth across the Testaments, neither man raising his voice. York described those sessions later. "We just examined the old Bible, and whenever I would bring up a passage opposed to war, Major Buxton would bring up another which sorter favored war. I believed the Lord was in that room." The impasse held for weeks. Finally, one night, Captain Danforth read from the 33rd chapter of Ezekiel. The passage about the watchman who sees the sword coming and fails to sound the alarm. When Danforth finished, York stood up from his camp stool and said 4 words that changed everything. "All right, I'm satisfied." Major Buxton, moved by the young soldier's sincerity, gave York a 10-day leave to go home to Pall Mall and pray. York climbed to a rocky ledge above the valley, a place he had gone to think since boyhood, and spent a day and a night asking God for an answer. When he came down from those mountains, the war inside him was over. He had made his peace. He would go. He would fight. And whatever happened next was in the hands of the Lord. He reported back to Camp Gordon and, from that day forward, never wavered. York shipped out with the 82nd Infantry Division on May 1, 1918. The division was issued M1917 Enfield rifles, a fine weapon, battle-proven, chambered in .30-06, capable of everything the war demanded. But York didn't like the M1917. His son Andrew would explain it years later in the simplest possible terms. Daddy didn't much cotton peep sights. The M1903 Springfield had open sights. Back in Tennessee, York had spent years shooting with open sights, reading the light through them the way a musician reads sheet music. The M1917's peep sight was an adjustment he was unwilling to make. According to family tradition and accounts preserved by the York family, he managed, through means that remain somewhat unclear, possibly trading with Marines or obtaining the weapon informally, to acquire a Springfield 1903 and carry it into battle. Whether he carried the Springfield or the Enfield into the Argonne Forest on October 8, 1918, is a question historians have debated for a century without a definitive answer. What no one disputes is what happened in that valley. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the largest American military operation of the First World War. 47 days, more than 1 million men, the final push that would end the war. The fighting was savage. The Argonne Forest had been turned by the Germans into a fortress of machine gun nests, interlocking fields of fire, and prepared defensive positions designed to bleed the Allied advance to a halt. At precisely 6:10 in the morning on October 8th, the whistles blew, and the 2nd Battalion of the 328th Infantry moved into the valley below Hill 223, near the village of Châtel-Chéry, France. The German defenders had known the attack was coming. They were ready. York was a corporal that morning. He moved with a patrol of 17 men, 3 non-commissioned officers and 13 privates, through the woods, flanking the German position. They came up behind enemy lines, surprising a group of German soldiers, including Major Vollmer, commanding officer of the 1st Battalion of the 120th Württemberg Landwehr Regiment. The Americans took the Germans prisoner. Then the machine guns opened up from the ridge above. German gunners on Hill 223 opened fire on the American patrol from close range. In seconds, 9 Americans were dead or wounded. York's sergeant was among the fallen. Command passed to the corporal from Pall Mall. What happened next is one of the most documented and independently verified acts of individual combat in the history of the United States Army. York dropped into a crouch the way he had crouched in the hills of Tennessee, and he began to work. The German gunners on the ridge could not depress their machine guns low enough to hit him. Every time a head appeared above the ridge line to locate the American, that man died. York fired with methodical, unhurried precision. The same discipline he had applied to turkeys, to deer, to every target that had ever put food on his family's table. Then 6 German soldiers rose from a trench and charged him with bayonets. He was out of rifle ammunition. York drew his M1911 .45 caliber pistol. He described what he did next in his own words, words that have been quoted in every account of this action ever written. I teched off the 6th man first, then the 5th, then the 4th, then the 3rd, and so on. That's the way we shoot wild turkeys at home. You see, we don't want the front ones to know that we're getting the back ones, and then they keep on coming until we get them all. 6 men charged. 6 men fell. The last one was the officer who had led the charge. From his position on the ridge, Major Vollmer watched the American corporal kill or wound every one of his charging soldiers without retreating a single step. He had emptied his own pistol at York during the attack. He had missed every shot. He stood up, walked toward the American, and asked in English if York was British. "No," York replied, "not English." Vollmer surrendered his command. Approximately 50 German soldiers emerged from their positions with their hands in the air. One threw a grenade. It wounded other Germans, not York. York shot the man who threw it, calmly, and told the rest to keep walking. He and his 7 surviving privates marched their prisoners back through the valley toward American lines. When they arrived, his lieutenant looked at the column of prisoners and asked York how many there were. "Honest, Lieutenant, I don't know," York said. The count came to 132 Germans, 32 captured machine guns, 28 enemy dead. Corporal Alvin York was promoted to sergeant on the spot. In the months that followed, the investigating board confirmed everything York had reported. General John Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Forces, called it the greatest individual feat of arms in the entire war. The French General Ferdinand Foch was more direct. He said York's action was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe. On April 18, 1919, the Medal of Honor was placed around Alvin York's neck. He also received the French Croix de Guerre, the French Legion of Honor, the Italian Croce di Guerra, and the Tennessee Medal of Valor. The man who had written "Don't Want to Fight" on his draft card had become the most decorated American soldier of the First World War. The Army discharged him. The nation prepared to greet him, and somewhere on the voyage home across the Atlantic, his Springfield rifle and his M1911 pistol vanished. When York arrived in New York in May 1919, the city went to pieces over him. There was a ticker-tape parade down Fifth Avenue, a suite at the Waldorf Astoria, a standing ovation on the floor of the House of Representatives. The Saturday Evening Post had already run a feature story on his Argonne action, and the American public was desperately in love with the simple, devout man from the Tennessee mountains who had done what armies couldn't. The offers came in waves. Advertising companies offered him thousands of dollars to endorse their products. Hollywood producers offered him movie contracts. Lecture promoters offered him touring deals that would have made him wealthy beyond anything his family had ever imagined. Everyone wanted a piece of Sergeant York. Everyone wanted to attach their name, their brand, their product to the man and the story. York turned them all down. Every single one. He explained his position once in a way that left no room for argument. Someone asked him to endorse a product. Accounts vary on whether it was tobacco or a rifle manufacturer or something else entirely, and York looked at the man and said words that became the summary of everything he believed about what he had done and why he had done it. "This uniform ain't for sale." He went home to Pall Mall. He married Gracie Williams, the girl he had left behind. The governor of Tennessee performed the ceremony. They moved onto a farm that generous Tennesseans had helped purchase, had 10 children, and York spent the next 4 decades not being famous. He built a school. The Alvin York Agricultural Institute opened in Jamestown, Tennessee, in 1926. A high school for children who grew up in the same mountain hollows he had grown up in, children who, like him, had almost no access to education. He dedicated it with words that say more about the man than any medal ever could. "To the end that my people of Pall Mall and of Fentress County and the boys and girls of this mountainous section may enjoy the liberating influences and educational advantages which were denied me, I dedicate this institution and my life to its perpetuation." He rarely spoke about the war. He did not seek recognition. He did not attend reunions to be feted. He was not in any way that mattered to him a war hero. He was a farmer, a father, a Christian, and a school builder. Now we come back to the rifle. When historians and collectors ask why York never tried to recover his stolen weapons, they tend to frame it as a puzzle, an inexplicable passivity from a man whose feats of arms were anything but passive. How could the greatest combat marksman of the First World War simply shrug at the theft of the gun that had made him legendary? The answer is that they are asking the wrong question. York's silence about the rifle's serial number was not a puzzle. It was a direct extension of the same principle that led him to say, "This uniform ain't for sale." The rifle was not a trophy. It was not a relic. It was not a collector's item. It was an instrument of killing, his killing, and recovering it would have served only one purpose: to put it on display, to sell it, to make money from the deaths it had caused. There is no documented statement from York explaining his silence about the serial number. There is only the consistent pattern of a man's entire life, a man who believed, with total conviction, that he had killed when God required it, and that no further profit, commercial, reputational, or material, was owed to him as a result. The uniform wasn't for sale. The story wasn't for sale. The rifle wasn't for sale either. His son Andrew, who knew his father better than any historian could, preserved the family tradition on the subject. York never divulged the serial number because he did not want the thief to prosper. That is a small and human reason. But it sits on top of a much larger foundation. A man who had done something terrible in service of something necessary, and who spent the rest of his life refusing to treat it as anything other than exactly that. The American Rifleman summed it up plainly in a feature article that remains among the most authoritative accounts of York's weapons. The 1903 Springfield and the M1911 were lost or stolen en route to the United States and remain missing to this day. The trail goes cold there. It has never been picked up again. In 2006, U.S. Army Colonel Douglas Mastriano led an expedition to the Argonne Forest to locate the precise site of York's Medal of Honor action, a location that had never been definitively identified. His team conducted forensic ballistic analysis on cartridge casings recovered from the battlefield. The results were extraordinary: 46 30-06 casings and 23 45 ACP casings, all consistent with York's rifle and pistol. The weapons themselves were gone, but the evidence of what they had done was still there in the French soil 88 years later. The expedition confirmed what York had always said happened. It confirmed the location. It confirmed the sequence of events. It gave historians the physical proof they had spent decades looking for. It did not find the rifle. The guns are almost certainly lost forever. The rifle may have been sold to a collector decades ago, passed down through an estate, sitting in a gun cabinet somewhere in America with no documentation of what it is. The pistol, the M1911 that stopped 6 bayonets in a French forest, is in the same uncertain darkness. Somewhere there are 2 weapons that change the course of a morning in the Argonne, and they carry no witnesses. Alvin York lived until September 2nd, 1964. He died in Nashville at the age of 76. By the end of his life, he was largely forgotten by the broader culture that had once paraded him down Fifth Avenue. He had spent years in debt, burdened by the farm mortgage he had never quite been able to pay off. His school struggled for funding. He had made almost nothing from the fame that had briefly made him the most celebrated man in America. The one exception was the 1941 film Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, which York eventually agreed to after years of refusing Hollywood. He used the money from the film, not for himself, but to build the York Bible Institute in Pall Mall. The film also contains the most famous misidentification in movie history. Gary Cooper fires a Springfield in virtually every scene, cementing in the public mind forever the image of York with a Springfield in his hands, regardless of what he may have actually carried into the Argonne. By then, it hardly mattered. The actual rifle was long gone. The legend had taken its place. What York left behind was not a weapon. It was a school that still operates today in Jamestown, Tennessee, as the Alvin York Institute, educating children from the same mountain communities that had no school before he built one. It was a grave in the Wolf River Cemetery in Pall Mall, under the Tennessee hills, where he had hunted and prayed and decided, one cold night on a rocky ledge, that a man could love God and still go to war. It was the example of a man who was offered the American commercial dream, the endorsements, the appearances, the movie deals, the manufactured heroism, and looked at all of it and walked away. Not because he was indifferent to money. He was often desperately short of it. Not because he was ungrateful. He was deeply moved by the country's recognition. But because something in him understood, at a level beneath calculation, that if you sold the story of the killing, you made the killing worth something it wasn't worth. The rifle is missing. Maybe it's sitting in an estate collection in Ohio or Georgia or Texas, tagged with a handwritten note that says claimed to be St. York's gun, with no one alive to verify or deny it. Maybe it was melted down or disassembled long ago. Maybe it's exactly what it looks like. A Springfield 1903 with a serial number that means nothing to anyone who holds it. Alvin York would have been fine with that. He never asked for it back. There is a statue of Alvin York on the grounds of the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville. He is holding a rifle. It is a Springfield 1903, the same model he almost certainly preferred, the same model his family swore he carried into battle, the same model that went missing on a ship crossing the Atlantic in the spring of 1919. The sculptor gave him a rifle because the story demanded one. But anyone who knew anything about Alvin York understood that the rifle was the least important thing about him. He was the man who wrote "Don't Want to Fight" and then outfought the entire German machine gun corps in the Argonne Forest. He was the man who stood in the Waldorf Astoria with the Medal of Honor around his neck and turned down every dollar offered to him. He was the man who went home to the mountains and built a school. The rifle is somewhere in the dark. The man is in the history books, not because of what he carried, but because of what he refused to sell. This uniform ain't for sale. In the end, that was the whole story. If this is the kind of history you come here for, honest, verified, without the Hollywood polish, subscribe to this channel and share this video with someone who would appreciate it. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. This has been the story of Sergeant Alvin C. York, one of the bravest men America ever produced, and one of the few who understood that bravery and humility are not opposites. They are the same thing wearing different clothes.